We like to think the elite level of our game, so the level that our professionals play, the level that our kids aspire to, and the level that we as fans watch, we like to think it's diverse. The international dimension of Australia's national leagues is something we can learn from, we can be proud of, and we can promote. But how diverse are our leagues? So how many of our national league players actually came from abroad? And do they really come from a wide range of countries and cultures, as the term diversity suggests? So as I've already been introduced, Andrew Howe is my name, Stats is my game, and let me answer these questions now with data. But also give you a little taste of these players, who they were. There's some really good stories there that I hope some budding writers might be able to follow up on. Okay, so first, as any like any good demographer, I need to define the study population, which are players from Australia's national league. So after the most recent A-League season, we now have 64 seasons of men's and women's National League player data to play with. Starting from that first NSL season in 1977, there have been 43 men's seasons, 21 women's seasons, with the first women's NSL competition starting in 1996. In all, 4,655 players have made at least one appearance in our National League. So that's a population about the size of Gerringong, if you know that town on the New South Wales south coast. All up, these players have played a combined almost 17 million minutes, 282,000 hours of National League football. Now, with its earlier start, more teams, longer seasons, the men's contribute the vast majority of these players, 80% of these players. And on screen now, I've got how that population, our study population, has increased over time. So in 1984, we reached 1,000 players. By 1995, we reached 2,000. And with the creation of the Women's League, since then, it's helped us grow to that over 4,600 National League players. Average age of men's players is 25.7. And it's now 2 years older than what it was when the competition started in 1977, which is actually a lot. It's aging a lot less than the Australian population. And in recent seasons, the aging slowed down. Our female National League players are younger. However, there's been a more rapid aging of W League players, reflecting, I think, growing maturity and professionalism in that competition. Okay, so I'm classifying each player. I've classified each player into either an Australian-raised or an overseas-raised player. And it's basically based on where that player lived up until I've created a cut-off of their teenage years. Now, for most players, it's a pretty clear-cut distinction, whether you're raised overseas or not. Yeah, so I'm not defining it purely on birthplace because a lot of players move here very young and don't get that football experience in their birth nation. And for older players, obviously, they've migrated here, say in their 20s or 30s, or moved here temporarily, when they haven't developed, then they haven't developed into that elite player within Australia. So they learnt their football in those critical development years, in the teenage years, in another country. And it's from these source countries, they bring their knowledge and experience that I'm assessing here in terms of our leagues. So they include one-off players, one-off guest players, and those hundreds of players who've settled down in Australia, often ending up as coaches or as parents of elite players themselves. Okay, so based on this definition, I've got 33% of all National League players were raised overseas. And these players have played a combined 28 minutes, so a little bit lower there. So it's saying that overseas raised players have shorter National League careers than their Australian-raised teammates. And yeah, a little bit of history. So the first 3 NSL seasons, over half of our players were raised overseas. So season 1 in 1977 had 55% of its players raised overseas. So it was a very important new league in a sense. Teams such as Heidelberg, Canberra City, Brisbane Lions, 70% of their initial squads were overseas raised. Then we had a fairly steady decline over the next 20 seasons. There's a graphic on the screen now showing this decline, getting to a minimum of 11% players being overseas raised in 95. And then with the A-League kicking off in 2005, we've seen an increase in those overseas players in terms of the proportion of that population. So now 1 in 5 A-League players are overseas raised, been quite steady over the last 5 years. So the W League has a slightly smaller share of its players from overseas now. However, there has been a big increase from 12 years ago when the W League started. And in recent seasons, about 1 in 5 W League players were imported from abroad. And here's a good time to point out that the women's NSL before 2005 was essentially state academy and institute-based, meaning there were hardly any overseas raised female players playing National League level in Australia until the W League started. Okay, some numbers now. We're talking in total of just over 1,500 overseas raised players, with 89 of those being men's league players. Over time, the shape of this numbers chart now looks similar to the percentages chart showed you before. There was a peak in 1984, was our peak year of overseas players, and that's when we had 24 teams, 2 lots of 12-team divisions. The presence of a New Zealand-based men's team since 1999 has pushed numbers up a bit over the last 20 years, and there was also a bit of a jump in 2009. A couple of A-League teams joined. Now, the W League, with its high reliance on imports, especially over the past 5 years, has added another 200 overseas raised players to the tally. Over time, the average age of men's overseas players is 28, although in recent years it's closer to 30 years old. And over all men's seasons, players raised overseas are on average 3.5 years older than their locally raised players. So the local players, who we like to think are the ones who learn from the overseas players, their overseas teammates are clearly younger. There's a similar differential with the W League, in that overseas raised women's players are around 4 years older on average, but that gap has actually come down in the last couple of years.